On February the 13th, the first sermon in the series was called Love is a Promise. And that was just an overview of the series, and basically we covered a few scriptures of promises that generally apply to everyone. God loves us, and so He makes these promises for our good, for our benefit. And so Love is a Promise was just the kickoff for the sermon series. Today we have the next sermon in the series, and we're going to learn today that promise presents choice. It's the Power Promise sermon series. We're going to learn today, we'll be hearing about Cain and Abel. These are two figures from the Old Testament, and they are children that were born to the first human beings recorded in the Bible. That's Adam and Eve. And Cain and Abel were brothers among many siblings. So as we'll see a little bit later, just because you start out with two doesn't mean you can't get very many people very rapidly. So in Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 4, I want to read just the story as it's listed in the Bible. We'll be jumping around just a little bit, but basically we're going to describe the story exactly as it's recorded in the Bible. So Genesis chapter 5, verses 1 through 4. This is the written account of Adam's line. When God created man, He made him in the likeness of God. He created the male and female and blessed them, and when they were created, He called them man. When Adam had lived 130 years, he had a son in his own likeness, in his own image, and he named him Seth. After Seth was born, Adam lived 800 years and had other sons and daughters. Now, Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, and Adam lay with his wife, Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. She said, "With the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man." Later, she gave birth to his brother Abel. So Cain and Abel are the focus of our lesson today. But understand that Cain and Abel were part of a larger family, and there were other people that were around them. And we'll see later that these people had very long lifespans. So as more people were born, there were more and more people that they had around them. Cain and Abel. And this is just an artist's depiction of Cain and Abel with their mother Eve. And off to the right in the back of the frame is Adam. So here's how the story of Cain and Abel plays out in the Bible. Cain and Abel went to present offerings to God. God accepts Abel's offering, but God rejects Cain's offering. So God had need to counsel Cain, and after Cain was counseled by God, Cain murdered his brother Abel. And then God confronted Cain. So these are basically how the story plays out. Let's look at them in detail. So the first part of the story is, let's talk about the offerings that they made. This is in Genesis chapter 4, verses 2 through 5. Now Abel kept flocks, and Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. But Abel brought fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering He did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry, and his face was downcast. Again, another artist's depiction of the scene. Abel is to the right side of the frame, and he's kneeling in front of his altar, and his sacrifice is on the altar and being consumed by the fire. Whereas Cain, on the left side of the frame, is standing by his altar, and his offering is laid on the altar, but no fire. So basically what the story tells us, literally, is that God accepted Abel's offering but rejected Cain's. So in the traditional mindset, when they talk about, oh, well, what does that mean? He accepted one and not the other. Usually that's depicted with a visible manifestation that one of the sacrifices would burn and the other one would not. Perhaps Cain should have used some lighter fluid. Okay. So after this happened, Cain was downcast. And so he went for, basically God counseled him. And the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast?" If you do but what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must master it. After the council, Abel became victim to Cain. Let's read this. This is Genesis chapter 4, verse 8. Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out in the field." And while they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Again, another artist's depiction. Abel slain, laying on the ground dead, and his brother Cain leaving him to die. After this event, God confronted Cain. The Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied. "Am I my brother's keeper?" The Lord said, "What have you done? Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer and vagabond of the earth." I want to comment for a moment on this and basically just remind you that Abel essentially was a farmer. Cain was a farmer. Abel raised flocks, but Cain was a farmer. And being a farmer, everything he would eat, everything he would contribute to family, to the people around him, his contribution was he would bring crops in that were raised, plants growing from the ground. So basically, when he killed Abel and Abel's blood spilled into the ground, this had the effect of impacting his life, something that was very central to his life since he raised crops, since he was a farmer. So God put a curse on the ground. You are now under a curse and driven from the ground. And basically, because Abel's blood was spilled on the ground, God was saying, your crops are not going to be rich in a harvest the way they would afterwards. So the curse came upon Cain. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so. If anyone kills Cain, he will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain, so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. And this is again an artist's depiction of Cain being driven from God's presence, being driven from Cain, being driven from Cain's family, from Adam, from Eve, and from his brother Abel, who lay slain on the ground. To understand the story and to put it in perspective, let's think for a few minutes of what life was like for the first people to have ever lived. And whether you believe the Bible literally or whether you believe it figuratively, at some point there was the first of our kind, the first human being. And if there was no other human beings, if you were the first, then that experience would be similar regardless of how you interpret the accounts of Genesis. So readers who interpret Genesis literally usually think about Adam and Eve in their solitude. Again, another artist's depiction of Adam and Eve in the left corner of the frame, and out behind a vast, empty landscape, a wilderness, hostile to them, but very devoid of other human beings. To be alone, to be totally and completely alone in the world. So people who think of Adam and Eve and of Cain and Abel, and they think of life in the beginning, they think of that solitude, but relatively speaking, their solitude wasn't that long. And let me show you what I mean by that. You know how to think in dog years. Dog is a year old, well, you think of him as really, he's on the scale of maturity of like a 7-year-old if you think of a 7-year-old human being, right? So this is what we call dog years. Well, try and think for a minute in Genesis years. Adam lived to be 930 years old, according to the book of Genesis. And when you compare that to the modern day, people in the 20th century AD can live to be in their 90s. So you kind of think of the ratio of a year to us would be kind of like 10 Genesis years. Eve gave birth to Seth when Adam was 130 Genesis years old. So relatively speaking, he was like a 13-year-old today. Well, there's a lot of teenagers getting pregnant, so this is not a surprising possibility that, relatively speaking, they would have been maybe that level of maturity expressed over their lifespan. But if Seth was born when Adam and Eve were 13 Genesis years old, or 130, so like a 13-year-old today, remember that Cain and Abel were born before Seth. Cain was actually the firstborn. And here's a quote from Genesis chapter 4, verse 25. Adam knew his wife again, and she bore a son named Seth, for she said, God has appointed for me another child instead of Abel, because Cain killed him. So when you read it in one passage, they start the family line with Seth, and it kind of implies that was the first child in the heritage or in the lineage. But really, it was Cain and Abel that were first. So again, relatively speaking, compared to Adam's recorded lifespan, he and Eve were only alone for a relatively short period of time. If you think about a person's lifetime being from birth to 93, Adam and Eve would have basically had children before they were quote-unquote 13. So lots of life after Cain and Abel. And so basically you could think of they started their family early in life.